Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Well, firstly, I hope Disney wasn't forced to enter. It was much more an optional and sort of mutual. When I kind of took the flight, I was making a few notes a couple of days back. I must say I was looking for a much younger audience. So I think, yes, I'm just caveating that in that sense that I think, but this is exceptional as far as I'm concerned, because I think if everyone's had between 3 to 7 to 8 or 9 years of work experience and coming here for a one-year course, I think a part of what I'm able to share today is going to be even more meaningful than if it was in the startup class. So actually, driving it here, it kind of got my mind spinning as to I think it might be interesting 1 hour and 4 minutes since we're starting 4 minutes early. I've made a few sort of general points, a few trivia, which I think are things that just I think of and what I think are issues that people should be aware of today. I then want to spend maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes talking about not just what has been my journey over the last 15 years or so, but more my learnings. And some of them are relevant as professionals, some of them are relevant when we're looking at our own business, some of them are relevant when we're looking at scalable, large companies, small companies, etc. And obviously, at the end of that, I think the key part of anything else, just gauging by the structure of this classroom here, is that it has to be completely interactive and a Q&A. And I think that will be more insightful because it will get me to understand exactly what are the key questions you want to sort of go through. Just to start off with, I think when I started, graduated from my commerce, and I had this crossroad, and that may be relevant to a few people, whether I needed to go into further education or I wanted to necessarily take up a job or I wanted to become an entrepreneur. The myth that I think most of you will now be experiencing it is sometimes always sounds like you're always very clear. Everything that you do right is always visionary, which cannot be the case under any circumstances because it's only in 2020 hindsight after that. So it almost sounds like everyone's very clear when they want to become an entrepreneur, everyone's very clear when they want to take a break. Actually, it's not. I think a lot of that sort of evolves, a lot of that is your gut feel at that point. And then when you introspect and you thought about it, sometimes it's the right decision. Hopefully more times than not it's the right decision, and a few times it's not the right decision. But I think at that stage, and I'm just giving you that as the climate in the country, and I think it actually stays put even today. When I decided finally that I wanted to look at being an entrepreneur, and mind you, that was the series and stage in life when actually anyone who did want to do a business was much more not a first-generation entrepreneur. So I think the differentiation in India of first-generation entrepreneur is quite a distinct qualification, and that it was maybe 15 to 20 years back. So if you sort of introspect at that, the general perception for most people, and I think it continues today except for maybe 2 or 3 cities, is that if you turn to be an entrepreneur, chances are your job prospect was not that good. So finally you decided to start your own business. And I've seen that when I've talked about people at Shaadi.com that the managed market actually goes down if you become an entrepreneur, because it actually means the parents at least feel, and that is there. I've interacted with people in Lucknow and in Chandigarh, and they say, yeah, but you didn't get a job, so you became an entrepreneur. And therefore, I think the shift of it being aspirational and something that is actually positive, which it is anywhere else. So you walk to Silicon Valley, you walk anywhere else, it is much more a prized possession. It's something that you've opted to. It's equal, if not above, under any circumstances. So I think this is an ecosystem for some of you all who are looking at this, not today, not as a graduate, but some of you all later on. I think this will be something that will be there in India. I think it's going to take the better part of the next 5 to 10 years for everyone to feel. And I think part of why I volunteer to even chat, interact, and be on forums is because I do believe that the context of entrepreneurship really needs to be evangelized. Not because everyone needs to strike out on their own. Also because today, and I can face it now having 1,100 people working for me in Disney UTV, that my entire DNA is spent with people to make all of them entrepreneurs. Now I know that's management jargon for everyone sitting in the management room, but actually it's not. Because the differentiation there is very, very strong. How do you get people who normally otherwise feel they have an employee status that actually you have a mandate, you have the liberty and the freedom to decide It is slightly within a box when it comes to a larger organization, especially rather versus a smaller organization. But with that box come a lot of other support functions. And how do we turn people with high ownership and high passion? Because I think the next century, the next decade, the next century now is about that. I don't think there is room anywhere in any organization. If you can find that the Fortune 500 companies over the last 50 years, the top 2,000 companies, only 7 have remained in the top Fortune 500. So there's been a churn of almost 1,990. So that reflects that that's the level of churn, and that even at that most stable level, there are companies that are multi-billion-dollar companies with 4, 5, and 6 years or 10 years of existence. And therefore, the key challenge for everyone walking out of even a classroom like this is whether you're going back to a professional career, whether you're upgrading what you're doing today, or whether you're planning to strike out on your own, or go into a family business, or any part thereof. How are you going to be able to get your internal instincts? And that necessarily actually means the highest level of passion, the highest level of ownership. And organizations and mid-level management, which you would normally enter into, the tendency is that's the slowest part of an organization. As someone sitting on the top, I have the luxury to see a company which is 1,10,000 people operating in 165 countries. And when I see that coming in from the outside as an entrepreneur, my learning the last 1 year is really that the mid-level is the key people that need to be empowered the most. Because the top level in most organizations get it, they know what they want to do, they're the quick decision makers. But the normal, when you see entering an MNC and this bureaucracy, actually there isn't. It's just how you're going to be able to divide between that core management. And therefore, when you're walking into that organization, you need to quickly understand, what is my role going to be? How am I going to stand out? What am I going to stand for? What am I going to do and take that forward? So that's just a sort of a summary of observation from that. Innovation, I think, is a very important criterion. And I know you all would have a lot of interaction with that. And for most people, innovation sounds like, creativity sounds like, yeah, again, it's a jargon word. But to me, as much as it is to be an entrepreneur and to have that passion, I think the other part is you have to constantly question what happened yesterday. Now, I know for a lot of people, that is scary, because you normally come into a job and then you look at a multinational because you want stability. Now, you may have stability when it comes to stability of job, but that doesn't mean that the requirement for being disruptive in your thinking is not required, because I think that is it. So for most people, innovation sounds like a eureka moment, not necessarily. It could be a different way to tackle exactly what you're doing on a day-to-day basis or a solution to your problem. Or, and in most cases, what it needs to be is a proactive way, because I think some of the old sayings of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I don't think apply anymore. Because there's no such thing. Somebody else is going to come from the right-hand side or the left-hand side. Doesn't make a difference whether you thought it was broke or not, but they're going to fix it in a very different way. And they've been more disruptive in their thinking. So some of those English phrases, I think, are pretty much out of the window when you look at that. This would be one such one, because if you're not being disruptive, and innovation, therefore, is not just about a bright idea. It's not about Apple coming up with the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone. It's a lot more than that. In fact, those innovations are the most difficult, because there's vision in 20/20 hindsight. You can't sit down and do a research and ask people, what would you like to see? What would you like to consume? What do you see in technology as the next barometer? What are the lacks you feel? You ask 100 people, what are you lacking? Nobody has that imagination to estimate that, well, I don't use a keyboard, I want to use my finger to flip a screen. I don't think that will ever come out of research. So how are you going to be able to do that and look at that and be a contributing factor? And for many of you all going back into large or mid-sized companies, the requirement for you to stand out, I think, is going to be how proactively disruptive are you in your thinking. And I know a lot of people get quite psyched because you think change, and there's constant change, and I've come in here for stability, so why do I have to handle change? I think if you need to. I think that is something that is almost a requirement today. And change is not bad. It's horrible if your boss or your colleague keeps coming back and going back on everything you decided yesterday. That is a non-acceptable change. I'm talking about constantly questioning the paradigm shift. So that's quite important. So if you look at it, here in India, we do have a lot of self-esteem about what we are, and I think we should, because sometimes I think we lack the confidence that we should have. But there are other days where I think we're so full of the fact that we believe that actually this is an entrepreneurial country, which I don't think it is actually. Everyone thinks if you can do business in India, you can do business anywhere else. Well, that's not necessarily true at all, because there are a couple of ways in which you think, okay, there's so many hurdles and so much headwind, that if I can solve the problems in my day-to-day life, I can solve it anywhere else. And the myth is that if I can drive in India, I can drive anywhere else in the world. Don't try that. Because if you try that, actually, there are more chances that you're going to have a problem than anywhere else. So these are some of our internal myths that we have, that we're a Jugaad nation. So, we invented Jugaad. When people write a book on Jugaad, they keep talking about India. So obviously, therefore, we're the Jugaads, we're the master entrepreneurs, we're the guys who solve problems before everybody else. I think it's half true, and it's half not. When you look at some of the ranking of how we stack in terms of innovation, from my experience on a global basis, I rank Israel actually as one of the key and one of the most dynamic innovators in the world. Not the Japanese, not the US in some form, not the Koreans in another form. Of course, you have segments and brackets. And I think that comes from the DNA of a small country. For the last 50 years, look at their environment. They're constantly on a vigil, rightly or wrongly, and I'm not standing here on a political statement whether Israel is right or Palestine right at all. I have a different view on that completely. But just a country that for the last, their youth has grown up with constantly being under threat, constantly having the pressure to be a guerrilla in every sense of the word. Does that affect your left brain? It has to. I think for all of us sitting in the classroom here, trying to figure out what you want to learn for the next 9 months of your one-year course, that it does have an impact. It has a very, very strong impact. And I think, therefore, when you look at innovation, and now you think of Israel, and then you think of the environment, the next thing that would happen, because I interact a lot with my senior management team, and they kind of sometimes say, sometimes I think we just create artificial pressure where there's none, just to get us going again. And the fact is, it is true, because from that actually comes a lot more thinking. So complacency, as we all know, is not, but how do you rule out complacency? Because it's nice to write down and say, no, complacency is always bad, because then you're in a phase of unlearning. Well, what are you going to do about that? Which means you've got to constantly create some sense of not crisis, but some sense of elasticity and stretch in what you want to do. And I think, again, therefore, if you look at the Israel example, it's just an example, it's just a connotation of what that is. And therefore, it would be odd to find that the maximum of innovation in technology in many, many sectors actually comes from a small country like Israel. And that's just, again, a thought process for everyone, to enter in your left brains when you look at that and sort of go forward. Now, a lot of people actually have asked me, there's professionals and then there's entrepreneurs. And frankly, I get quite weary defending both sides many times because I really don't understand the actual difference. Obviously, when you're working in an organization, you could be an entrepreneur, but the minute you stop being 4 and 5 people, in any case you have to be professional. I cannot identify necessarily the difference in that context. And therefore, I believe that the combinations of being entrepreneur and professionalism, or having an organization that has the right mix of both. So if it's an entrepreneur, the first thing he needs to do is hire professionals around him. And I don't mean professionals in the inverted commas, because they're not entrepreneurs, then you're not going to get the right language. But I think the key element for a professional or somebody who's looking at execution, deep-seated research, and you take that with the sort of somebody who has the guts to be able to take uncanny decisions, to be able to go a little bit on gut, but I don't mean gut in a wild manner from that point of view. Risk-taking ability sometimes is the sort of threshold between you wanting to take a few steps forward and not. And that's what you look at in an organization. Because most of the time when you read your manuals and your operating manuals, it's about what you can't do. You read a manual on as something as basic as leave record and on the basis of an operating manual, and you read the language, and I hadn't read it because I founded a company, and then we merged with the Walt Disney Company. I was curious, and I said, I should maybe read it. 1,100 people are going to sign it, and I'm going to sign it, I should read it. And the first time I read a manual, it sounded like a lot of don'ts versus do's. And therefore, at the first town hall we had, I kind of broke up that bits and said, all of these are absolutely correct. But now let's reread each of these sentences as a positive versus a negative. And I think everyone went away not feeling constrained in a large organization just by breaking up that same line, that same paragraph, and making it into a positive statement. So I think that's something that can easily be done. When you're reading something, it can easily look like, oh, this is what I can't do versus this is what I can do. And I think, therefore, that mix of entrepreneurship and professionalism is the sort of broad parameter that I want to sort of leave behind when we're talking about broad points. I want to just go to my personal experiences. I've listed about 7 or 8 or 10. I just want to headline each of them. Trending forward, to me, has been one of the most important learnings. You've got to be able to see, necessarily a little bit into the future. Now you may say that's fine for someone at the top. What's that got to do with me if I've got my KRA? Well, if you've got your KRA, and if you're planning obviously to live within that KRA, that's perfect, and I think that's the right thing to do. But in that KRA, you're going to be able to, you put in a little bit of disruptive thinking, and in that KRA, you're looking at 2 years hence and 3 years hence, in looking at whatever, the way that business is going to look forward. This is a very, very important criteria. So I think when you're in any form of leadership position, which is what I'm sure you're all going back to, or you'll come from and going back to in that context, constantly looking at trending forward is a very, very important criteria. Second, I think, is scale. One of the key things I think in India, outside of the fact that we really don't market ourselves very well globally, and then when you do, you find that there's a sense of amazement as to how you attract people, but actually it's a lot about gathering the presentation skills, is scale. I really do believe that, like, outside for a few companies here, why is it that India hasn't come up with the top companies, except for when it's oil and gas, which is much more natural resources, not management skills that have got that there, or banking, which actually China has overtaken us by leaps and forwards, is really how do we look at scale? And that is an important element and criteria where I think people miss out. Whether you're running your own business or you're looking at your business, whether it's in consumer products or technology or IT or hotels, how are you going to be able to build scale? And the few people in this country that have been able to do that have worked well. My other hypothesis on that, which comes to my third point, not in any order of importance, is focus. So for most people, I think focus sounds like the right word, but actually when you do a litmus test, do we really focus? Because if you look at that, most family businesses in India have felt they've succeeded by being a diversified lot. So every baseline of every family will be in cement, in this, in that, in real estate. And at least 2 new areas that in the last 10 years have become, 10,000 crore market cap opportunities, they're in it, or whatever it is. But they have not in BPO, they'll get in BPO. If they have a 2-hour handle BPO, one of the sons will figure it out, and so on and so forth. That is not prevalent in today's context. And you will see that actually some of these companies that haven't got that very good sale, when it gets down to actual focus, that's when you really excel. And I think you take that back into if you can look at focus, and if you can look at scale, and you put that into your paradigm of whatever you're looking at, whichever part of the business that you're running in an employment basis, is going to be a very, very critical element of evaluating that and cross-questioning yourself on an ongoing basis for that. Today, I think it's important that anyone walking out or looking at any job needs to have an appraisal in their own mind, if it's not put into your organization, of impact. I think more and more, especially for a country like India, you have to be able to measure, if you want to set your own goals personally, career-wise, in any form, what is the impact that I'm necessarily creating in that job? Because the minute you put that as a non-KRA item, but in there, and you measure it and you're the best person to judge from that perspective, it's going to change a lot of what you're looking at doing. What is the impact that I'm creating when I'm going forward? That impact could be to 10 colleagues of yours who then feel very different. Impact doesn't mean social. You don't have to go out there in rural and start figuring out how education gets solved in the country. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It's just any form of necessary impact. And I think measuring what impact you're going to do, whether it's in cross-learning, in any form, as you go forward, and it might be very, very nascent. And walking out at 31 and 32, you say, I really can't make an impact. Well, I'm saying I would force you to write it down and measure it once a year. Because 5 years or 6 years after you've trained yourself to write that and actually measure it, you'll be surprised how it will become a very strong part of your DNA. And I think for the next 20 to 30 years, it's very important. If you're planning to stay in this country or in any other country, if you are looking at that one word and measuring impact in any form, you have to figure out what that is. I think it will make a differentiator between ordinary leadership and exemplary leadership. And I think that's something that I think everyone needs to sort of hold on to. Where I came from, actually, when we started the media industry, there wasn't one. And therefore, because there's not one, everyone calls you a pioneer, which means, again, nothing in life. Because you're pioneering and you fail, nobody calls you a pioneer. And if you're a pioneer and you succeed, then everyone calls you a pioneer. So that I'm sure there are a lot of people before Columbus went out to sea, didn't, land, their boat didn't bump into land with buggies to figure out this is where I've landed. And does it necessarily happen by accident? No. But does it always happen with clear-cut, articulated vision? No, either. And I think that's really something that is quite important for everyone to sort of understand. Because the gap between being pioneering and being before your time is actually the difference between success and failure. Because if you're before your time, you're either going to lose your shirt and pant, or necessarily you're going to have a lot more money than you ever thought you needed. Your team may be demoralized. All of those aspects come in. So I think you've got to look at the sectors that you're in and what is the pioneering element you need to do. If you're working in a company, I think it gives you the luxury to test pioneering a little bit better because you have a fallback arrangement. There's always an ecosystem that's going to protect that thought process, whatever. If you're in a smaller company, you need to test that further. I don't think today it's a virtue to be a pioneer. I think it's equally good to be a second or a third player. Okay. Knowing full well that this is also going to be a market in India and worldwide where the top two players winner takes it all. Whether we like it or not, that is how it's going to work out. And in any segment, in any industry, through a geography, you're going to have top two players that are going to make money and the next 8 that are going to struggle. Now, obviously there'll be exceptions, and if you look at health in India and pharmaceuticals and sectors like that, I think top 10 will survive for the next 20, 30 years because there's such a big gap between demand and supply, or even supply that I think is of a certain caliber and value that we can give. But in most sectors, you need to therefore test that hypothesis as you go forward and not get fascinated with the word pioneer, but keep that again in the back of your mind. And that is, I think, part of our thought process. We think we've succeeded. It's because we've been measured about our pioneering aspects in an industry where almost an industry needed to be created. So today, somebody going into agriculture, going into health, going into education, going into whatever, actually is creating an ecosystem because an ecosystem doesn't exist today. So how do you are a pioneer in some sorts because you're not only creating a company, but you're creating some sense of a sector and industry. And how in that do you protect yourself from not being before your time is something that I think is an important element, and that's definitely been a very strong learning for me. A lot of people, as much as they say, visionary and then you go to pioneer, comes the word luck. So again, everyone says necessarily when you've done well, you were lucky. And I think I've tried to break that definition down a lot of times. To me, it's really been when you're in the right place at the right time. I think that's what everyone means when you're lucky. Because actually, when you are in the right place at the right time and something has worked out for you, you're the last person to admit that it was luck that got you there, right? I mean, you want to feel that you got yourself there. What is this luck abstract thing that's got you there? And I think how do you sort of break down that evaluation? And it's important because when people refer to that and say, this worked, you're lucky. Actually, it means you're in the right place at the right time. So then you sort of work backwards from that and you say, so if that's really the context of being lucky, how do I get more lucky? Or how do I get lucky more often? Which actually means, am I in a position to prepare myself to be in the right place at the right time, or be as prepared as I can be for seizing an opportunity or evaluating an opportunity when I happen to be in the right place at the right time? And of course, the key question everyone asks is, but after all of this, how do you know when you're right in that spot, whether you're in the right place at the right time? Well, I think the level of preparation for you to be able to examine what you're looking at, and I'm not trying to be abstract, but if you're in a particular business and you're looking at that and you feel this is the cusp of something new, but for example, broadband is 2 years away in technology, but when you want to look at any aspects that's going to harness that, am I going to be a pioneer, am I going to be before my time. If I see something here where I run out of money, to give you one example, same in health and education, same in health. I want to set up 30-bed hospitals, but actually government gives subsidy only when you have a 50-bed hospital. And the ecosystem says it is not below 100 hospitals, and you start running a chain. How is that going to necessarily work? But you've got to therefore figure out that at some stage, I'm creating an ecosystem, and how do I prepare myself to be in the right place at the right time? And the more you can think about that, and it's not an easy answer, there's no reference to context, you can't necessarily learn it or read it from a book. It has to be your own developed instinct over a period of time. But I do believe that you could look at being, into inverted commas, more lucky if you can pre-plan being in the right place at the right time. When that opportunity comes, and your sense, it is your instinct that knows this sounds like an opportunity, and if you grab it, then you're in the right place at the right time, for which you need to be very well prepared, not just in an opportunity form, but your whole left brain, right brain has to be seized of the matter that this is really what I was looking for. Last month I've been thinking this happened, this happened, now it's happened. And I think that is really what you call the lucky break. So I just want to break that myth down, because for a lot of people, they go through life and they feel, yeah, I mean, I did this, I worked hard, I had an 18-hour day, I did this, but I wasn't lucky. And I think you need to introspect, because that's too abstract a word that you have to reconcile with every day that says, if I was just a little bit more lucky, I would have gone somewhere else, versus, am I really in control of my own destiny? And of course, 99 of the people in this room will believe in karma, and 99 of us will believe in destiny. But I think it's a mixture of that, because you've got to be able to reconcile with that and feel you're a lot more in control of what you're doing, whatever part, with your family, with your career, whatever else. So this, I think, is a learning curve. But the earlier you kind of sort of enter that into your system, I think it trains your mind in a very different way. And I think that's been, fine-tuning that has been a strong learning lesson to me as I've gone forward. Dealing with skeptics, I think, is an important other element. And I know because India has this crab mentality, as we all know, where if you're climbing up in the fibers, people first more busy bringing you down than necessarily figuring out how you can climb up with you and say, oh, he's there, why don't you join him? Because, oh, he's there, let's get him down. Let's go back to base camp and then let's figure out what you want to do. And I think dealing with skeptics, and that could be, again, in an organization, you could be 5 people in one division, or one pharmaceutical company, one marketing division, or you could be running a business. This is something where the level of self-confidence that you build in yourself is going to be able to do that. Because skeptics can actually pull you down in any day. And you could be having a bad day, and outside of a bad family day, you could be having that. And if you look at that, it's mostly because of negative energy. And negative energy not in any other form of criticism or people looking at things in a different way. So I think dealing with skeptics and dealing with that, with your own inner self, is a very, very strong learning again for me over a period of the last 15 to 20 years that has put me in sort of good stead. If I was to summarize 1 or 2 or 3 top things that actually have taken me to where I am, one very strong word for me is resilience. And that actually means for me staying the course. In almost any aspect of the job or the business, you will find opportunities and instances where you feel this is the end of the world, and this is not going to go anywhere. And there isn't a solution in mind, and I challenge anybody to find a solution to get me out of this problem, because now all the doors are closed. And that's the key test of whether you're going to be able to stay the course, which means, are you convinced that you're not going to go back and suddenly decide, A, I want to join another job, or I want to go into a more secure environment, and how am I going to stay the course? But the rewards for resilience are humongous. Now, this is not a textbook thought process. There could be a situation genuinely where all doors are closed. That doesn't mean necessarily that your solution is just stay in there and says, no, I know resilience, just stay there, one door will open. It won't. Now, the solution could be that I want to stay the course, but in a slightly different way. You might need to completely alter your business model, you may need to completely alter your job. But the conviction of what you want to be, for what you thought you want to do from your impact point of view is going to be quite important. Staying the course has huge rewards for success. And if you look at that in business more than anywhere else, or in a small business, that actually is really the differentiating factor between success and failure. Why do 99 out of 100 entrepreneurs fail? I don't think they fail. I think they call it a day. I think failure is not necessarily there because you move on, you move into some other part of your career, you've lost some money, it's a great learning experience, you move forward. So fail is not a word I would use because then that's a stigma that stays in your brain and you want to go into that. But if you look at that, you've got to recalibrate yourself. And I think therefore staying the course is really, really, really very important. In some of the parts, I think, to me, constantly when one was building a media business, the phrase that I kind of used, and it came out because we were sitting down and creating a video, I think in 97 or 98, Rupert Murdoch from News Corporation Fox, Starks, that was coming down to India for the first time. And we were pitching for him to invest 49% into UTV at that time, which he did 7 days later with the term sheet. So we wanted to make a 7-minute documentary. And scale of business in this whole country at that time was obviously very small. We were doing a lot of different unique things in television. We weren't even in movies at that stage and whatever else. So one of the creative people came up with a line that said, "The whole is bigger than the sum of the parts," which I think we all can identify with in that context. And that is something that with all his insight he had heard of. So he loved that line. He loved the positioning. He loved the fact that here was this 30-people company at that stage that actually felt that the whole was bigger than the sum of the parts. Actually, we didn't really think that way at that time. But the creative line sounded so good that we used it. And then it became something that, here was this experience person who come on and told us, damn good, this is real good stuff. And I'm going to go back with this kind of situation. And that was a sort of an eye-opener. But it is, after that introspection that the whole should be bigger than the sum of the parts, when you look at that, again, and put it into reference to context with whatever you're doing, is a very, very important criterion. Because if you put that and start looking at that, because you feel, then it goes back to focus, it goes back to scale. There are a lot of other things when you look at that phrase and keep testing that and evolving that the whole should and can be bigger than the sum of the parts. And I think that has been part of our, what I would call mantra for the last 10 years, which has allowed us to look at being in diversified fields, but being very focused in those fields, with core expertise in each of those fields and us to be able to do that. I mean, in 2006 or 2005, when we decided to start a movie studio, everyone in the country thought we were absolutely mad because we're now a 100-year-old industry in 2013, so we're a 93-year-old industry, completely incestuous. Everyone had to know everybody else, as you find out when you walk out there and walk past the shooting that's happening there. Everybody is family to each other. We didn't know anybody from that perspective. We everyone started a movie studio. And I think for us, the only way we could look at that is we wanted to be a B2C company. And therefore the best way to be a B2C company in media was, how do I touch millions of people in one time? And the best way to do that was the big screen. Because actually, it's the big screen and the small screen and the mini screen, because your product gets consumed year after year in some form or the other. It doesn't end in a theatrical window from that point. But it has the largest impact value. I mean, today, in our business, movies constitute not more than 25% of our revenue. But I get 9 out of 10 questions on media is always about movies. Because that's just the larger-than-life impression that people have, even though we do an incredible amount in consumer products, or in games, or in television and in broadcasting. So I think the disruptive thought for us when we sat down and said, we want to get into this B2C business, and the best way to do that is either you start your own channels, which we did, and we wanted to look at the studio. And this is a good enough example, because I'm not giving you a media example actually, I'm giving you a real-life example which can be for anything else that you would do. I want to touch millions of consumers, I want to build a brand, and I want to do it with scale. Now obviously, those were nice when you go to Marway or Goa and make a 2-day vision statement, that's what you want to do. And you've got to come back and need a roadmap and how you're going to do that. And I think a couple of things help. One, research, which we strongly believe in, and I think it helps a lot. Research to me polishes your gut incredibly. So research is a very important tool to polish up your gut. It's a validation sometimes, it's a trigger sometimes, it can be used with many tools, it's just a thinking device. And since you were doing a lot of that in television and everything else you were doing, we knew that young India was looking for something different in the grammar and the narratives of what they wanted to consume, rather than the hardcore family dramas, which had everything from the vamp to the item number, to the villain, to the family, to the 3 generations and all that. And that was one. And I think the other part was that there was an entire new generation of people, because the more we interacted, we felt, and this is again a very strong learning for me, that it is always, always better to work with new mindsets than change existing mindsets. And I was talking to some of you all in the cafeteria downstairs, and you were saying everything is an enlightening moment out here. And I think that should be the case, because of the simple reason that you're actually starting to say that I have so many preconceived notions, and now they're getting shattered. And I think that's most relevant. And that comes back to, are you questioning yourself and being disruptive every single day of your life? And the fact of the matter is you need to. So that's really what it was. So here we wanted to look at a different storytelling and drama and grammar. We wanted to sort of hug the industry, but not too hard, because we knew we were going to get repelled if we did too much of that. We definitely wanted to sound like being the underdogs, because that's the best way people come up and help you. Otherwise it doesn't work. And we worked, so there was nothing about acting about it. We were genuinely underdogs. But most importantly, we started working with new talent, new set of directors, a new set of scriptwriters. And from that, our sort of breakthrough moment was when we did a film called Run Viva Sandeep, which was sort of the benchmark of what we thought. And it gave us a stamp that said, yes, our sense was that if you offer strong content, and of course, throw in an Amir Khan, it always helps. But regardless of that, it's a strong enough concept which gets people to think. It was a movie that, for me, didn't end when you left the theater. Some way or the other, bad, good, ugly, angry, whatever it was, rubbish, ridiculous, good, fantastic. Reactions came in for the first time, which don't normally come in a family drama. Because you walk out of a current horror movie and you do a lot of work with him, and I love him completely. It doesn't give you that kind of level, except some of the movies that we're doing together with him. So to me, that was the breakthrough. So to us the challenge was, how do we go from a B2B model to a B2C model? And I think that to me is a sort of good learning example of you check out whichever way you want to do that. If Samsung decides they don't want to be a contract manufacturer sitting in Korea and have a headquarters here, now they want to go out to the customer. Do I want to do it in my country? Do I want to do the world as my geography? Do I want to excel in one country and do it somewhere else? Those are the key elements that you ask. And most of the times, new mindsets, disruptive thinking comes in there. And I think more now than ever before is a very, very important criterion. A couple of last ones there. Control versus, control versus what I would call professional management and CEO. Again, I think part of the reason why in India you are not seeing too many scalable companies is because most promoters are obsessed with control. That 51% seems to be the magical figure with most people. And I think, in my aspect, the first day in which, in '96, when we sold 49% at that stage to Rupert Murdoch and News Corp, subsequently we bought that back 8 years later. The minute you actually divest 5% of your company, or you're more than a single owner, from that your mindset has to be that you're working for a group of people. And I think if you start doing that, then it does make a difference whether you're 80%, 51%, or 26%, or 25%. Because from that day onwards, you are moving into an accountable measure, where if you're not the best person for the job of managing, you should get somebody else to do it. Because then, from then onwards, shareholding is a wealth creation objective, and not a control mechanism. And I think if you look at that differentiation between shareholding being a wealth creation opportunity. So, and I want to sort of end my thought process, because a lot of people ask me the questions, yeah, but you built and you sold things. And I'm saying, no, I've built things and I've created value from them. That's how I look at it. Somebody else would look at it as I've built things and sold from that perspective. If at every given stage, you're there to figure out for that company, its entity, and the people that work for it, the customers that work for it in the business, what's the right and best thing for it to do in that. And if you're true to that context, you will find a solution. If that means disengage, then that's what it is. If it means necessarily sell out, it means that that goes forward. And I think if we have done that, it is because we think that is the right thing to do at that particular point in time. We've created not necessarily a business to sell it. Today, in today's age, and especially when you look at e-commerce and many of the new media companies, the whole DNA is, how do I exit in 5 years? I think it's completely flawed. If you start a business to have an exit plan on day one, it's just fraught with danger. Because your entire thinking process is so radically different. How are you going to think about that? You're mostly thinking about value, then you start looking for people. And today the biggest culprits are the investors. It's the same investors that we've seen in some sectors that are in big trouble here. It's really because the investors, they sit in the boardrooms there and they say, let's go for top line. But all fundamentals are based on bottom line, aren't they? Yeah, but let's just go for market share. And where's your next cash flow? An entrepreneur, 5 years into his business or 10 years into his business, suddenly gets these 3 shareholders that are rich with deep pockets, comes in there and starts talking about revenue, and when you want your next cash raise, and how do you go about getting next cash raise? I'm going to lean back and start thinking what he does. I haven't thought about what's my unit mechanism, what's my matrix, what are my entire profitability benchmarks, how do I take my costs down, do I evaluate this? No, let's go hire some of the best people, let's overpay, let's do that. So I think this is something in the ecosystem that we need to be clear about. At every stage when we built a business and we felt to take it to the next level, we need to do X, that's what's happened. We started a kids channel called Hungama at a time when we had just gone public. We were 9 months and we had just gone public. And part of the process was the day we went public, we had this eureka moment that says, we don't want to be a B2B company, we want to be a B2C company. And I remember with the police and everyone thinking, yeah, but now we're public, we've got quarterly accounts. You can't suddenly remorph this entire company to something completely different, because quarterly wise we need to talk about what we have, otherwise everyone thinks we've gone mad. So in the next 18 months, we had to hold on to our B2B business and turn the entire company into a B2C business, because genuinely, within the first quarter of understanding what analysts were looking for and whatever else, we knew we were going to be in a big problem, because B2B are not always in control of your destiny. In B2C, you're a little bit more in control of your destiny, which means you can fall off the cliff or stand at the top of the mountain, but at least you're in control of your own destiny. And we chose that that's what we wanted to do. At every given stage when we started a kids channel called Hungama, our insight was that kids were watching Z Horror Show and movies, and were not really watching content for themselves. That was our one single insight, and we felt, therefore, we wanted to start that. We were in direct competition with actually Disney at that time, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, and many of the others, who, by all the analysts and everyone who sat in front of me with all the conventional wisdom said, but you don't understand, they've got 5,000 hours of programming each that they come here with. Their cost of programming is 0. How are you going to compete with it? You're going to lose a lot of your public money, and stock tanks on 20% as soon as we sort of announced we were doing that. Cut to 6 or 8 months later, we decided our biggest advantage was that we were not straddled with the libraries that you own. We went out and picked up 2 Japanese animation series called Doraemon and Shinchan, which a lot of young parents still keep throwing darts at me. And it became the #1 channel. And 18 months from then was the first time we got a call from Disney saying, would you like us to partner in the kids channel? We said, well, you got yours, we've got ours, why should you do that? And almost 3 months later, they made a proposal to buy out the channel and also make their first investment into the company, which is my precondition, that I'm not selling something. But to me, having brought it to that stage, what was the next destiny for that vehicle was to get into a network, not a single channel kids, where at some stage it would have got beaten up once everyone realized what our strategy was. So exiting, people think exit is getting it right. I can only tell you one thing. Timing is the most important part of any context of exit. Exit by itself means absolutely nothing. Getting the timing right is about the most critical element. So I think it's 12:09, and I'll look at exiting my single part of the conversation and throw it open to Q&A. Thanks.